So the first method is find by activation token, right? And you can see that by default it's already got an argument, which is a string, so which is a token that's going to be passed to this method, which is what we're passing from our activation or activate action single action class. You can see that we're passing the token that's coming from this route token from our controller, right? So we already got the token and we're passing it to this method. So back into our repository, we're going to take that argument and we're going to get the token for it. So we're going to say token equal new token, which is our token class from our utility directory, just like so. And we're going to be passing in that token argument. Let's actually differentiate this. Let's put a underscore at the start so we know the token is not the same as the argument. So this is imported. Let's add some dot blocks to it. So now we've got our token, we've passing the token to our token object, and we're going to get the hash value for that particular token. So we're going to say going to create a new variable called token hash. Token hash is going to equal token, which is our token object, and we're going to get the hash, right? So we're getting the hash value for that token that we've just passed to our token object, right? So now that we've got the hash value, that's going to be the same hash value that's already within our database. So we're simply going to try and find the object via that hash value. So we're going to say find by, it's going to equal this, and because we are using our user model, we've got access to the user database and all the repository method that's part of the core. So we're going to say this get repo, which is how we access the repository. Are we going to say find object by? Now this is a method within a repository which returns a single object by a condition, and the condition that we're going to be passing in is the activation token. That's how we're going to find the object. So we're going to say it takes an argument which is going to be an array, an associative array, and we're going to find activation token, and that's going to be assigned to token hash. Token hash, just like that. And the second argument is going to be an array as well, and we're simply going to pass in an asterisk, and what that does is going to return all the columns within that particular object. So it's going to get us all the name, email, password, everything, right? Put a semicolon there to end that statement. Then we're going to say if null isn't find by, then we're going to return find by, just like so. Else, or not else, just return null otherwise, because the method states that the return type should be null or an object. So if we haven't got an object, we're just going to return null, right? Now that's the method, the find by activation token. So we create a new variable and we assign it to the new token object, and we've passed the token that's been passed down to this method into that token object. Now we're going to get the hash value for that particular token, right? So we've got the hash, which is what's already in our database, because we would have hashed it already within our user model or our user validate class, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And then we're going to create a new variable called find by. This is going to get the repository, fire up that find object by method, and we're going to get the user object via the token, via the hash token within the database, right? And we're going to return all the columns within that particular table for that particular object. So let's bring up our user validate class, and we're going to show you all the information that is being submitted to the database. Now, you never have to worry about this. Well, you can use the user management system that I've implemented, or if you go ahead, or if you want to create your own, you will have to then create your own user validate class, because it might contain columns or fields that's not part of what I've already done. So if you want to deviate, you have to take that into account as well. But information that I'm taking is the first name, last name, email, password, which is what you see on our registration system, and the rest of it, activation token, is what is being done for us automatically. Same with the status, which is going to always be pending by default, and the default information is coming from that YAML file app system, and it's going to say default status. So let me quickly show you that file as well. That's going to be in our config app, and if I scroll to see the system bit, which is system, right, and within that array we've got default status, which is set to pending. Now you can change this to whatever you want, and that will be the default status, but it's wise to set it to pending so a user can verify that they're valid and activate their account based on the link we're going to send them. So that's where you see the default value is coming from. Right, in the admin section, which we've not done yet, we have the option to set the status ourselves. We can select what status we want to give to a user when we're creating that user. Hence the reason why we've got this value right here, because it's looking for a form field called status with a value. If not, it's just going to get the default value, right? We've got other bits and bobs right here, like created by ID, Gravatar, which is automatically generated for us based on our email address. If we've even got a Gravatar account, it will just give you a default icon. We got remote address. I mean, you can use this if you want, or you could omit it. But the part that I want to show you is the activation, the token, and how the hash is being generated, right? So I've got a hash generator class within the utility, and let's bring that up as well, because I want to provide you guys with as much context as possible. So let's go to our utility directory and our hash generator, right? It's a simple class, and you can see it uses that token object that we've just talked about. We're saying token equal new token, token hash equal token get hash, and activation hash equal token get value. I was simply returning those two variables in this return statement, which is going to return an array. So if we go back to our user validate, you can see what I'm doing. I'm using this PHP list function, right, to get those two variables that I'm returning within the array, which is the token hash and the activation hash, and that's going to equal to the hash generator object on that hash method, right? So the token hash is what I'm essentially sending to my activation token in the database. So we can say in our previous in this particular class where we say get hash, we're getting the hash value for that token that we're generating, right? So that's how we send that value to our database. So once we register, all these will get filled out with either data that we specify or data that is set by default, right? So you can also see that the activation hash is what we're going to be sending to the user via the email address. So I want to get back to this file in a little bit, because there's some more stuff that I want to demonstrate that is going to be useful for us to know when we come to writing the event and dispatching. So I'm going to leave this file open for the time being, because I'm going to touch back onto it to also show you how we get that activation hash within our event so we can send it to the user's email address. So we need to, at this point, we've created our repository class for our activation. We got our activation control sorted out. We've got our routes sorted out. I've shown you how the token is being generated, how it's being hashed and sent to our database. So we can close this file. We can close the interface, and now we need to now go to our registration class, our registration action subscriber class, because that is where we have to implement the methods that's going to send an email to the registered user. So let's close these down for a bit as well, and let's close this up. Let's get back into our app directory and our event subscriber, and we want to get our registration action subscriber class, because this is where we're going to be implementing those little feature. Right now, one of the things that I want to do is, you can see that within this particular class I've got no constructor method. Now by default, if I declare a constructor method within any of my action subscriber class, I can auto wire any dependency to that constructor, right? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to demonstrate that. So I'm going to say public function construct, just like so. So the reason why I'm putting a constructor in here, because I've got other classes that I want to import in to help me build this email system that I'm going to use to send email to the registered users. And one of those classes is going to be the mailer facade, right? It's going to be mailer facade. I'm going to give it a variable of mailer, just like so, right? So I'm going to import this class in a minute, but what this does, this contains a method, a basic method that allows us to send a basic email, right? So it did not import that for us directly. So let's create a private mailer facade property, just like so, and call it mailer, just like so. Now that's now imported that for us, and that's coming from our core directory, or mailer component, right? So the next one I also want is my base view, and it's going to be view. I'm going to create a property for it, a private property. It's called base view. That's coming from my core directory as well, and I call it view, because I need to get access to the templating features, so I can send an HTML template to that user email. Now I'm going to simply assign these properties to this variable. So I've got mailer get off mailer equal mailer, and this view equal view. Now that's what I want to do for the time being, and I don't have to worry about instantiating these for me, because as I've just said a while ago, once I've created a constructor and passed these type entered class in, they will be auto wired for me. So effectively now I've got the mailer object and our view object, right? So down in the bottom I'm going to create my first method, which is going to be public function, and let me go back to my activation repository method, and it's going to send user activation email, right? So forget that. I'm going to create a method called send registered, or send registration email, registration activation email. You can call this method whatever you want, right? And because I need to access the actual event and object, I have to also take in the event or pass in the event object argument. So it's going to be activation or registration, I should say, because we're in the registration event. So it's going to be registration action event. So any method that we create within our event, our action subscriber class, we want to access the object or the context or whatever, we have to pass in the registration action event, type into that in plus the event variable, or you could call this whatever you want, right? That's going to give us access to the object, which is the controller. It's going to give us access to the context which we've passed to that event, and I'm going to show you how we've passed that context to the event. And it's going to give us access to the method which is firing that event as well, right? And that is accessible through this object. So what I want to do now is I want to create the code that is going to send a email to the user. So one more thing we also have to take in notice is that with the event dispatching, whatever method that you've got in this class, whatever method that you're executing, you have to be aware that it will fire all of these methods once it is activated. It will fire these methods, and there might be a case where you don't need a particular method to be fired. So what I've done, I've created a simple helper function which is going to only execute a particular method only on, or a particular code on a particular method. So what that looks like is if this onRoute method, right? The onRoute method is a method that I've created, and this is located within this event dispatcher trait, which is in the core directory. And what this does, it allows me to only execute a particular bit of code on a specific method, right? Which is what I want. And the argument that this takes in is the actual event, and I can put the second argument is going to be the route, which is the action that I'm going to be firing this event on. And the action that I want to be firing this event on is the register route, right? Within our registration controller, because only when we register, I want this code to be to operate. I want it to send an email only when we're registering, right? Hope that makes sense. Let's spell that properly. So it's event, just like so. So now that I'm sure that this event will only get fired on the register route, I can then go ahead and implement the code. So I'm going to say user equal this, say event get context. Right, so what is the get context? The get context method is a method that contains all the data about the registered user, right? And I said to you I was leaving a particular file open because I want to show you where the context is being defined and how it's being passed along, so we can access it through our event, right? So we've got a method called databag. Validated databag is a method within our validation class, or any validation class, which contains the actual context, and the context that it contains is all the data that we're submitting to our database. All this information right here that's already been validated and passed to our database, we now have access to that within our databag. And you can see that we're using array merge because we're merging two arrays together, and the second array that we're merging is a random password, right? So this only applies to the backend. So how I've set up the backend is I don't necessarily want to create a password for a user. I want to leave a field blank, and by leaving a field blank, the script will automatically detect that, and it will automatically generate a random password for that particular account. Now, I've got the value of that password in this array right here, which I'm going to be posting back to my event, right? And the reason why we need that is because if the password is being generated dynamically or randomly, the user need that random password as well to access the account. So we're going to send that random password within that email address, within that email to activate your account as well, because you're going to need that password, right? So the validated data bag is where we get all of that data. So we're returning two variables within this return statement. We've got the new data, which is what is going to be submitted to the database, and the validated data bag, which is a method which contains that same variable which we're going to send to our event, i.e. the context. So all we then do that is I'm going to show you a method that takes that context and hand it down to our event. So all we then do that is by making, well, I think it's best if I demonstrate. So let me just close down some of these and let's get you to my data object layer, because this is where all the magic's happening. And my data repository, and let's get this abstract data repository class open, right? So I only want to demonstrate a couple of stuff in here. I don't want to go through all of it because it's quite extensive. So let's find that method that I'm looking for. No, that's not the right class. It's going to be my data repository trait. Now this is the one I'm looking for, right? So if I take you back to this user validate method, I'm returning an array that contains two variables, right? Now I'm going to touch on this a little bit, but not too much. But you can see that I've got this list method within this validate repository class method. I've got this list statement which is equal to this validate before persist method, which is the same method validate before persist. That's the method that I'm calling, and I'm getting the two variable that is being returned from that particular method within this trait, right? The first is going to be assigned to a property called clean data, and the second is going to be assigned to a property called validated data bag, right? Now that validated data bag is just being returned in a method called validated data bag, and because this is a trait which is attached to my repository, it means that I can access this method using my get repo method within any model. So let me demonstrate what I'm saying. So back into my let's just close down some of these. Let's just close this user validate, and let's get my domain classes back up and running. Let's get base, domain, action, activate, action. Now this is not a good example to show you where that context is being passed in, because you can see the fourth argument within this dispatch single action event should be the context, and the context that we're submitting on this particular event is just the action, which is a boolean, which is going to be either true or false, which is either did the activation work or did it not work, right? Which doesn't explain a lot. But if I open up another single action class like the new action class, you can see the fourth argument in this one is accessing that validated data bag. That is a context, and we can get that through our repository get repo validated data bag, and it does whatever controller this method is being used, that is the context that's going to be passed back for the particular controller, right? So if we are using this method, for example, in a permission controller, then the data that's going to be passed back is the data from the permissions table, right? Now, that's a good example. The fourth argument within this dispatch single action event method is the context, and the context that we're getting back is the validated data bag, which we know, as we've just showed it within the user validate, is all the information that is being submitted to our database. So that's where the context comes from. And if you've not already know, the context is being generated from our base action event, right? Because all of our event is extending this base action event, and all the method is defined within here. So we've got the get method and the get context method, right? And the get object, and you can see we're simply returning the context, which is defined within the constructor. So we've got the method, context, and the controller object, which is being assigned to these properties, which we're simply returning within these public methods, right? So all of the event class that we create within our app event directory is going to be extending this base event class. So if I look at the activation, you can see we're extending that base event, so we got access to all those methods. And because we've got access to all those methods, we can say user equal event get context, and because we're in our registration class, we have access to all that user information that is being posted. So we got the context right here, so we got all the information that we require. So let's carry on implementing this send registration activation email method, right? So I'm going to say if is array user, because the information in this context should be an array. So I'm checking that it is, and I'm also checking that it's actually got at least one element in. So it's going to be count user is greater than 0, then and only then we're going to continue. So we're going to say mail equal, which is a new variable that I've just added, mail is going to be equal this mailer, and we're going to get the basic mail method, right? Now this basic mail method is a method that is defined within my mailer facade class. So, and this takes 1, 2, 3, 4 arguments. You can't see what I'm seeing, but I've got a little pop-up on my screen which shows me what arguments this takes. Let's just fix that up. So the first argument is going to be a title, right? Or it's going to be a title. Let's just over again and see what it says. So, well, it's going to be a string. The first argument is not a string. It's a string, which is the subject. The second is from, who the email is from. And the third argument is to, who the email is being sent to. And the fourth argument is going to be the body, the message, right? So the subject is going to be, we're going to say new account, right? The second is what we say is going to be from. So we're going to hard code this for now, but you can imagine that you could dynamically pass in the email address for your application. But I'm going to say admin at, let's call it YouTube project .com, something like so. And the third argument is going to be to who the email is being sent to. Now this is the part where our context comes in, because we're going to say user email, right? That's the user email. And if I take you, let's just close down some of these files because we've finished with them. Close that. new action, close that. And let's quickly bring it back to my user validate class. You can see we've got the email field within our database. That is the field that we're accessing within our event. So we're getting the email from the user variable, which now contains that array of data. And the fourth argument is going to be the message that we're sending. And I'm going to be creating a separate method which is going to format this message for us. So I'm just going to go above here. I'm going to create a private function because this function is only going to be used within this particular class. So private function, I'm going to call it template message, just like so. And this is going to take in a couple of arguments. First, I need the event, and I also need that user array. So I'm going to say registration action event, and an array of user data, right? So I'm going to simply pass this method as the fourth argument. It's going to be this template message. I'm going to pass our event object and that user variable that we got right here, right? And why is that doing that? Expected parameter of type string void provided, and it's not the case. So yep, it's going to return a string because it's going to return a message which is a string format, and that error is gone. So now let's try and create that activation link that we're going to be putting within the email. So I'm going to create a variable, say link, and it's going to be event, and I'm going to get object, which is the controller, and I'm going to get a method within my base controller called get site URL, which is going to get the URL for our application, right? And that takes in an argument, which is going to be the actual path or location of our activation controller. So what we can do is we can actually create a constant that's going to hold that for us. So let's just do that. Let's just go up top, and I'm going to say it's a protected const, and it's going to be called activation path. And that's going to equal a string, which is going to say activation. Let's go in lowercase. Activation is going to be activate, just like so. And I'm simply going to pass that within this argument. I'm going to say self activate path. I'm going to go a forward slash, just like so. And I'm going to concatenate the activation token or the activation token from our database field. So I'm going to say user, and I want to access this activation token field, right? So let's copy that, and let's go back to here and paste that in there, just like so. So that's effectively going to show us the same URL path that we looked at earlier, activations / activate / that token, right? So that's the link that we want to send to our email address. Now I'm going to create some HTML which we're going to format and send in as well. So I'm going to say HTML, and that's going to equal a div, an opening div. It's going to be HTML, concatenate the closing div, just like so. So HTML, concatenate, and I'm going to add a h1 tag, which is going to be the headline. So it's going to be h1 open and h1 close tag. And between this tag is where I'm going to get some information from my, well, I can make this dynamic, or I can make it, I can hard code it in, but I'm going to hard code it in for now, and then later on we could put some dynamic data from our YAML file, so we can then change it if we want to change it. So what I want to say is activate your account. Just leave it like that. Second line down, we've got HTML concatenate, and I want to actually send that random password as well. So I'm going to say is it user random pass, because that is what we've called it in that return statement, random pass. That's how we access that random password, right? And because it's merged with all the data, we can just reference the key to get the value. So random pass. So if it's set, so that's what I'm saying. If it is set, then send it. If it's not set and we've actually inputted a password for ourselves, then we already know what that password is. So we're going to leave that blank. So if it's set, we're going to send that random password, else just an empty string, just like that. Or we can actually put some text right here as well. So we can say the p tag, the paragraph tag, put it in a strong tag, so it's bold, and we can say temporary password, because it's gonna be made up of characters that you might not always remember. So it's always wise, once you logged in for the first time, then you change that password, which we've not implemented yet, because we will be implementing a password recovery system that you can use to change your password. Right, so we've said blah blah blah. Let's take this out and let's put it in, let's format it in. So we're going to say quote quote dot dot. I'm going to paste that in just like so. So it's part of that HTML string, right? It's going to be within that paragraph tag, just like so. So the line below, we're going to add a message. So we could say HTML, and we're going to say something like please click the link to activate your account. Please also make a note of your temporary password. Right, now for the last one, I'm going to actually create the anchor tag for that link. So HTML concatenate a anchor tag, and I can, let's put that into a paragraph, so it's going to be on its own line, or a div, either doesn't matter. The href, and we're going to say activate now, and we're simply going to pass in that link variable that we created earlier. Let's fix that up properly. I'm going to paste our link in there and put a semicolon there to end our statement, and that's it. That's our HTML that we're going to be sending to our email once a user is registered, and we've simply passed that method as our fourth argument within this particular method. So now what we need to do now is to actually execute that method. So we're going to copy the name of the method, and we're going to come up top, and we're going to simply put it below here, just like so. So once we do that, then we know that this method is going to get executed once we fire this actual event. So I think it's time for us to actually give that a quick test and see how it works. And earlier I mentioned about mail trap. Once we put that information within our .env file for our mail server, that's pretty much all we need to do, because our mailer component already takes care of all the connections internally. It just requires you to actually have a server to test on, right? So let's actually give that a quick test.